Hi everyone, I'm Professor Noor, and Dr. Narcissi invited me to speak in your class about how I use theory in my own research. Unfortunately, I teach during your class, so I'm not able to visit you in person, but I'm really excited to get to talk to you virtually. And I hope that you'll follow up with me with any questions you might have. You can email that to me or visit my office during my office hours. So Dr. Narcissi asked me to speak about feminist and queer theory, and I think that's a really good fit because those are the types of theories that I use the most in my own research. I'm a creative writer, and so my research means that I produce literature. I create books and poems and stories and novels in verse and all kinds of good things like that. And I would say that the most important way that I use theory in my work is I like to think of theory as a lens, sort of as a pair of glasses that you can put on to see the world with certain things in mind, certain things at the forefront of your focus and attention. So, for example, when I'm thinking with my feminist theory lens on, I'm thinking about gender relations, I'm thinking about power dynamics, I'm thinking about praxis, which is important in feminist theory, so what you do, what you practice with it. And I'm thinking about intersectionality, right? So, how do our systems of oppression and privilege overlap and connect with each other and interact with each other? So I'm thinking about that a lot when I do my work as editor of Switchback Books, which is a poetry press that publishes works by women writers. And we have to think a lot about how our authors' feminist identities and identities as women writers come forth in their work and how they speak to each other. And so that informs a lot of the ways that I might market a book, the way that I might recommend that that a writer think through making edits on their own book, and the ways that we're going to organize events for the writers' conference or for different kinds of events and readings that we might have. So feminist theory offers me that lens, which is really great. Queer theory is really exciting for me in my poetry, and it comes up a lot in my own work. When I'm wearing my queer theory glasses, I'm thinking about performativity of one's gender and identity. I'm thinking about coding language, which is huge for poetry. We're always coding our language and representing things through interesting figurative leaps and associative syntax and things like that. I'm thinking about naming, and queer theory is really interested in how discourse is an action. So when you say I do, that's a series of words, but it's actually joining you in union in certain ceremonial circumstances to another person through marriage. So naming as an action, queer theory is great for messiness and complexity. It doesn't let you have easy answers, and it asks you to stretch your mind and consider all possibilities and just get into the intricacies and complexities of language in particular. So that's great for a poet. I wanted to give you some concrete examples of what these look like, so I have books to show you. This is a prose book that I wrote called Super Mario Bros. 3. It is about the video game Super Mario Bros. 3. So it was a long, in-depth research project looking at the history of this video game, what kind of influence it's had on the video game industry and on pop culture. But what I did in particular in this book that was new and important was looking at the game and my relationship to the game growing up and playing it as a little kid through a feminist lens. This is what I pitched to the editors, and this is what they accepted, and this is what a lot of the book is about, is reading this game, this text, Super Mario Bros. 3, through a feminist and queer theory lens. So what does that look like? That looks at reading different articles that imagine Bowser the villain and Mario the hero in a sort of homoerotic relationship. That looks like sort of critiquing the princess in the game as a damsel and thinking about the ways that my young queer self liked rescuing the damsel, even though my feminist woman self doesn't really like that women always have to be the damsel. So again, complicated, no easy answers. This also looks at doing readings of myself in the characters, right? So as Mario, when I'm a little kid playing Mario, I'm embodying the space of this little Brooklyn Italian plumber rescuing a princess. So I'm getting to enact my fantasies of being with women as a 5-year-old. But I also am the damsel as the woman, and I also am the monster as Bowser, as feeling this queer shame at my hidden identity. So queer theory played a really big part, and feminist theory played a really big part in my book. And I was able to interview some other women gamers and women in the game industry to talk about their feminist perspectives on the game. And I would say it was a little bit less high theory work, like a literary scholar might do, but it hugely influenced the angle through which I approached my research of this game. Another book that had a lot going on with gender and with feminist theory and queer theory for me was Copper Mother. And so this is a book about what would happen if aliens found the Voyager Golden Record, which is floating around in space and was launched up there in 1977, and they came to visit us. So I have a female hero here, and she's going on a quest, a sort of introspective quest, and making contact with these aliens. And I think that a lot of my narratives of contact between different cultures or different people is informed by a sort of feminist perspective of intersectionality and identities, and just kind of looking at critiquing the power dynamics between any two parties when they come into contact. Last but not least, I have a book here that I wrote. This is my most recent book of poems. It's called Megacity Redux. And this book is hugely influenced by feminist literature. It's a response to a 15th century medieval French allegory called The Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan, the world's first professional woman writer. And in her book, Pizan is imagining a city where women could live safe from sexism and misogyny. This is back in 1405, but we still need that city today. That's what feminist theory and feminist literature and feminist activism tells us, which I believe. So I tried to recreate the city, create my own version of the city. In Christine's book, she calls her fairy godmothers who help her build the city reason, rectitude, and justice. In my book, I go on a road trip with my fairy godmothers, Xena Warrior Princess, Dana Scully from The X-Files, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer to try to locate a modern-day version of the city where women can live safe from sexism, violence, misogyny. There's a lot in here that was influenced by queer theory. There's huge performativity elements in the kind of costumed heroes going on this quest, performing their gender in really different ways, right? So Xena is a very tough, butch type of woman, and she's got a sword, and when a man bothers her, she cuts off their head, and she's sort of a caricature of this violent kind of radicalism. But that works for her. That's her type of feminism. Whereas Buffy sort of spontaneously starts crying in the car at one point because she really wants to decorate cakes, stay at home, not work, and be a stay-at-home mom and wear high heels and wear pink and wear dresses. And she can't reconcile that with her feminist identity, which a lot of women go through. So she's trying to navigate what her feminism means for her, right? So there's these different types of feminism, and they're conflicting. I think that all three of the characters, as well as my own self in the book as a character, sort of represent my fractured self and different elements of who I am as a feminist and a writer and a woman and a queer person. So queer theory gives us a lot to think about with that, and I think that filtered through into my work. So the last couple things I'd say about how theory influences my work, I've mentioned how it affects my editorial thinking and my editorial work. I've mentioned how it sort of affects the ways in which I think about my characters and my plots when I'm writing, or my research projects in the case of Super Mario Bros. 3. But the last thing I'll leave you with is that I think the most important influence that theory has on me as a writer is how it helps me read better. So when I can read a novel or a book of poems or a play and think about it through these different lenses, I'm going to understand it and appreciate it better. And good writing comes from good reading. So we have to be reading, we have to be comprehending and thinking through in all kinds of different ways what a text is doing and how it's working, right? So when I'm reading, I'm always thinking, I'm always applying those lenses sort of in my head, and it's all jumbling around together. And the more that a writer like me has going on up there with things they've read, interpretations of what they read, really cool abstract esoteric theories about the way we perform our gender or the way that we enact discourse in the physical world, all of that ends up coming through in your writing. I like to think of it as just one big stew, one pot with all of these different ingredients mixing around together. And when they can rub up against each other and when they can create interesting friction and interesting tension, you're going to have cooler things in your writing. You're going to have more variables, more complexity, more interesting things. I don't think that if I hadn't read Judith Butler, right, a queer theorist, I don't think I would have written this book. I don't think it would have come into being just because I wasn't aware of that way of looking at the world. So I'm really thankful to theory, even though it can be tough reading sometimes to slog through, and it's challenging for me to read theory. It's not something that comes natural. with all that in mind, I still have a ton of theory books on my bookshelf that I'll dive into and that I'm very grateful for helping me see the world through these different lenses and enrich my own writing, my own reading, my own editorial practice, and I think my own experience as a human being. So that's all I got for you guys. Thank you so much for listening to me. And like I said, if you have any questions or want to talk any more about theory and creative writing, or feminist and queer theory in particular, I'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your class.